Welcome, and I think we will get started. I'm Laura Johnson. I'm the Director of the International Land Conservation Network, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. I have with me in Cambridge, Massachusetts in the U.S., two other members of the ILCN team, Emily Myron and Isabella Gamble. This webinar is entitled, What Does the Paris Climate Agreement Mean for Land Conservation Organizations? This is the first in a series of webinars addressing a wide range of conservation finance, legal, stewardship, and governance topics. And I want to let you know that we are recording the webinar and that it will be made available online in the coming days. You have all joined this webinar in a listen-only mode, which means you are muted. So please submit questions in the questions pane on your computer screen throughout the webinar. We will be collecting the questions to be included in a moderated Q&A after the presentations. And if you experience any logistical or technical issues, please also ask for help through the questions panel, and we will be in touch with you to try to resolve the problem. Also present with us today are our two presenters from California, Andrea Tuttle, and from Canada, Rob Wilson. I will introduce them more completely in just a moment. But first, a little bit more information on the International Land Conservation Network. We've been in existence for about 2 years, and our mission, as you see here, is to connect organizations and people around the world that are accelerating voluntary, private, and civic sector action that protects and stewards land and water resources. One of our early efforts has been to identify organizations involved with private land conservation around the world. And as you see with this slide, it is substantial. To date, we've identified over 2,000 organizations in over 120 countries and territories. These organizations are widely diverse, from very small volunteer organizations to large professional groups. And the interest in networking is genuine and widespread. We see ILCN's role as including convening, such as these webinars today, sharing ideas and best practices, promoting partnerships and collaborations, and raising awareness. With that very brief background about ILCN, I now want to introduce the first of our presenters, Andrea Tuttle. Andrea is a former director of the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection and now consults on forest and climate policy. For the past decade, she has attended the UNFCCC climate negotiations as an observer for the Pacific Forest Trust, focusing on the development of REDD+. She was an early promoter of the forest protocols for California's successful cap-and-trade program, which puts a price on carbon and includes forests as a compliance offset. She has consulted in Southeast Asia and China on sustainable forest management and now chairs the board of the Pacific Forest Trust. She also serves on the board of the U.S. Endowment for Forestry and Communities, supporting working forests, new forest products, and forest-reliant communities. And again, please remember to submit questions throughout the presentation. And now I'm going to turn it over to Andrea. Andrea.
Thanks, Laura. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining the webinar. This is a new topic for most of us, and myself as well. Although I've attended the UN climate negotiations and participated in projects with land trusts in California, I had not put these two tracks together until challenged by ILCN on the question that is the subject of this session. So the question we're looking at today is, how can your conservation project participate in the climate programs of your country? Most of you in the audience are probably already involved in some sort of conservation project that attracts your passion and your commitment. It's fantastic to see the wide range of countries that are on this call. And the common denominator is that most of you in some way are working on protecting habitats or ecosystems on lands that are in private ownership. So this question deals with the intersection between projects on the ground and the broader climate programs that your country may be pursuing under the umbrella of the Paris Climate Agreement, which was adopted with great celebration in December of 2015. Of the 194 countries that have signed on to the Paris Agreement, we're now up to 136 that have completed the process of country ratification. So the chances are good that wherever you're from, your country has made some sort of pledge to address the challenge of climate change under the auspices of the Paris Agreement. The topics we'll cover here are intended to give a high-level introduction and offer some suggestions on actions you can take. First, we'll give a very brief interview of the history and architecture of the Paris Climate Agreement, and then we'll suggest some practical first steps, such as how you can find more detailed information on the contents of your country's pledge and who you can contact for further information. Part of the goal here is a two-way street. First, it's to provide you with information, but also to introduce yourselves to the agencies and contacts involved so that they know who you are and they're aware of your interest. And of course, you'll also be exploring if there might be some opportunity for assistance or funding of some kind to help your project either now or in the future. So by the end, I hope you'll have some takeaway points that first, your project can be an important contributor to the climate efforts of your country. Secondly, because the Paris process is still so new, you may be able to influence its development and implementation, both to the benefit of the climate and to your project. And three, it's important to speak up and let people know that you're interested. So let's start with some basic vocabulary of climate action. This is familiar to most of you. In general, we categorized actions into two groups. First, those we call climate mitigation, which result in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. As you know, it's the increasing concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that causes the atmosphere and the oceans to warm. Mitigation is further divided into actions that reduce the combustion of fossil fuels, such as by substituting with non-fossil alternatives like solar and wind and hydro and biomass, and by increasing energy efficiency. And then there are actions that increase sequestration, which accelerates the removal of CO2 that's already in the atmosphere, such as through photosynthesis and long-term carbon storage by plants and soils. Sequestration is also sometimes used to refer to engineering approaches that remove greenhouse gases from smokestacks before they reach the atmosphere. The second general area of climate activities is called adaptation, which refers to actions that help people and habitats cope with changes that are already occurring now, such as rising temperatures, sea level rise, increased wildfire, and extreme weather events. So with mitigation and adaptation in mind, now start by assessing the climate benefits that your project provides. Your project may have a primary focus on protecting some special habitat type or landscape, but now consider what it also does in terms of mitigation and adaptation. Especially look at how your project increases or protects carbon stocks. For example, does it grow new vegetation that would not have occurred without your project? Does it restore degraded areas and rebuild carbon stocks that used to be there? Does it protect existing vegetation that would otherwise have been destroyed? Then, in terms of adaptation, consider whether you're performing some type of management that improves the resiliency of the site to the impacts of climate change. That is, do you improve conditions for species that are or will be stressed by climate change? And 197 countries have now signed on as parties to the convention. The stated goal is to achieve stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations at a level that would prevent dangerous human interference with the climate system. So the debate over the years has not been on the science of climate change. That evidence has only been growing stronger. But the debate has been between the developed and developing nations, primarily over who has responsibility for reducing emissions as countries develop going forward and who should pay for it. Ultimately, of course, the conversation has largely turned to finance, and how we can pay for a global transition to a low-carbon economy. In the negotiations now, setting up the different mechanisms for delivering and tracking finance is one of the major ongoing topics. So after 20 years of debate, you can understand what an emotional celebration it was to finally reach an international agreement. The text was adopted at the 22nd Conference of the Parties held in Paris in 2015. The primary goals that were agreed to include keeping the global rise in temperature to 2 degrees with an aspirational goal of limiting the rise to below 1.5 degrees Celsius, reach the peak of global fossil fuel emissions as soon as possible, and undertake reductions in global emissions rapidly according to the best science. And almost most importantly, a new structure was adopted that recognized that all countries have a responsibility to contribute, both developed and developing, and that this would be a bottom-up structure for all countries to contribute voluntarily to meeting the goals, not top-down. There's still language recognizing the challenges that developing countries have, and there are special provisions for the least developed countries. But the mechanism calls for all countries to put forth their own voluntary pledge of what emission reductions they can achieve through their own domestic actions. These efforts are to be reviewed by the international community every 5 years, and the pledges are intended to be increased over time by countries as their capacity, technology, and finances improve. The term that's used to describe these voluntary pledges is nationally determined contributions, or NDC for short. So with this background, now we can start by making the link between your conservation project and your country's commitment in the International Paris Agreement. So where do you start? You've already given some thought as to what the climate dimensions of your project are in terms of mitigation and adaptation. And now you need to see what kind of pledge your country has made as its NDC. So here is where you can find the text of all the NDCs that have been filed so far with the UNFCCC Secretariat. The NDC registry is within the UNFCCC website, and when you look at these slides later, you'll be able to see the website better. So let's look at an example. Here's the NDC filed by the government of Costa Rica. Now, just as a detail, note that this is listed as an intended NDC, not a discrete NDC. We're looking at the Costa Rica NDC, and this is just as an example of what an NDC looks like. The text looks something like this. The point is not to focus on the specific content, but to see how an NDC might be laid out and what to look for. Here we have paragraphs describing the development philosophy of the country and its commitment to decarbonization. We have mitigation and adaptation measures it will pursue, what the planning process will be, and how they plan to implement their goals. Next slide. So this Costa Rica example has a specific appendix on mitigation, and note that it includes a policy option for enhancing carbon sinks, land use and reforestation. This is the type of language you want to look for in your country's NDC because efforts related to the land sector probably have the most direct link with your type of conservation project. So look for something referring to land use or specific uses such as forestry, wetlands, natural habitats, or language that has to do with enhancing carbon sinks. Next slide. This example also has an appendix on adaptation broken down into community and ecosystem adaptation. Again, look for descriptive language that encompasses in a general or specific way what your project does. Now that you have some substantive text of your MDC, where do you go for further advice and information? First, find out what the responsible agency is for submitting the NDC from the country to the UN Secretariat. It should be on the cover page here for Costa Rica. It's the Ministry of Environment and Energy. Now you can do your own research on who you think you should make connections with. Can you contact your federal ministry directly? Are there local or regional offices you can contact? Are there other officials to talk to? The point is that you want information on how the NDC is being administered, and you also want them to know that you are interested and to recognize the value of your project in helping them meet their national pledge. Another possible source for information is to contact the office of your country's focal point to the UNFCCC, which you can find at this link. The national focal point is the official single point of contact between the UNFCCC and your country, and with that office you should be able to explain your interests and request other contacts. So by now, a key question for many of you is probably, will all this effort result in any potential new assistance or money to help support my project? All I can realistically say is give it a try. It totally depends on the dynamics and the implementation plans of your country, but it doesn't hurt to ask. One of the major intents of the MDCs is to match needs with finance sources. Particularly for developing countries, this means that countries first list what emission reductions they can accomplish domestically on their own, and then countries can also flag activities that they can't afford on their own, but they could do if they had assistance from other donors or sources of finance. Much of the effort in the negotiations now is setting up the mechanisms for matching country needs for funding and technology with different sources. So this next slide looks complicated, and I don't intend to go into detail here. You can look at it more carefully at your leisure. But it is a helpful graphic to map the various categories of climate finance that are in the mix. At the top, it starts with the basic divisions of funds that come from governments versus those that come from private markets. Then it traces through various entities and processes that money can flow through. You'll see the international finance institutions like the bilateral and multilateral banks, like the World Bank and regional development banks. You'll see various types of government donor agreements and official development assistance from country to country. And you'll see the private sector involvement, both as donors and as participants in carbon markets. This is where the Red Plus program falls, which is aiming at a market-based program for tropical forests. Again, this is a big topic, but this gives you a start in understanding the different categories of effort and discussions that are going on regarding climate finance. So now let's look at a specific example. Here's a grant program established by Brazil known as the Amazon Fund, which is directed at curbing deforestation. This illustrates how climate finance can be made available to individual projects on the ground. The fund is financed by the governments of Norway and Germany as major donors, along with the National Brazilian Oil Company, and it's administered by the Brazilian National Bank. It specifically funds projects related to forest protection and management, protection of biodiversity and sustainable agriculture and forest production and so on. And here's a map of projects that have been supported by the Amazon Fund. Now, not all of these are NGO-sponsored projects, but note the yellow highlighted text that shows that NGOs and civil society organizations are called out as eligible to submit proposals for consideration in the fund's grant process. So the point is, your country may already have some sort of similar program, or whether you are a developed or a developing country, you could suggest that they could consider setting up such a program as they begin to implement the land-based portions of their NDC. What you want is to establish that conservation projects on private land are an eligible category for consideration, since rightfully your projects can contribute in a meaningful way to both mitigation and adaptation. Now, another consideration you need to make with your project is how much emphasis and energy do you want to place on the climate side of your project. If you actively wish to participate in a carbon market, this will require the highest level of commitment to a quantitative approach. Here, your intent would be to generate verified carbon credits either for a compliance market or a voluntary market, and you would need to meet all the technical and social requirements to obtain verified emission reductions. Our next speaker, Rob Wilson, will illustrate with an example of this in more detail. On the other hand, though, many of you will prefer to stay with a more qualitative, programmatic approach. Here you would have less rigorous requirements for quantifying the carbon reductions from your project, but your land base will still be contributing to your country's inventory of its land sector, and it will be reflected in its national accounting. Some countries report on their total vegetated area, usually divided into categories of forests and wetlands and so on. Some of this data is based on satellite mapping and some on ground mapping and inventories. But the point here is that by letting your country know that you're interested and that you represent a category called conservation projects on private land, then you may be able to get special recognition as a key partner in the land portion of your NDC, since you are actively committed to delivering benefits to the ground. One last point, just briefly, is to see if your country is proposing to use a landscape approach for its land sector. Some countries with large mosaics of forest and agricultural areas are looking towards broad planning approaches to reduce emissions from their land sector through better coordinating and negotiating the trade-offs between competing land uses. The point here is to inquire if your country or your region is pursuing such an idea and see if it makes sense for you to participate with other stakeholders. So we're just about finished here, so let's sum up some of the main takeaways. First, the NDCs are still very new and most of them lack detail. So this is an opportunity for you to participate in their development, especially for the portions dealing with the land sector. What you want is that the NDC recognizes your project and recognizes your climate contribution in the country's accounting. Secondly, you want to learn who your national, regional, or local climate representatives are and keep in contact with them. And it's also good to learn about other NGOs and their projects with which you may be able to form working coalitions. So as we wrap up, let's step back for a moment and remember that even if you don't get directly involved with your country's NDC and its complexities, still your project probably offers already great positive benefits to the climate. So keep on doing it with the passion and commitment that you already have. You may find opportunities to participate in and improve the NDC, to raise the profile of conservation projects on private land. You'll establish some contacts. You'll alert your country's officials that you're an interested partner. And you may find some opportunities for funding if project or landscape approaches become available. Overall, I definitely think it's worth making the effort to become more informed, to become recognized as being interested, and being an advocate for all that you do. Here's the starting point for some references on the topics we've mentioned. Recall that this and the following presentation will be made available to all of you through an ILCN link. So thank you for your participation. I'll look forward to your questions after the next presentation.
Andrea, thank you so much. This is Laura Johnson again, your moderator. That was a great presentation. I do want to apologize here on our end. We had a little trouble with our audio, which made it difficult for us to follow some of the slides in the middle there. We think we fixed it, so my apologies. And again, we want to remind you all that if you have any questions, put them in the chat box, and we'll be compiling them to be part of our Q&A session at the end of both presentations. So let me introduce our next presenter, Rob Wilson, who joined the Nature Conservancy of Canada, NCC, in 2007 after many years with the TD Bank Financial Group. Rob is the Director of Conservation Finance in the New Conservation Strategies Group at NCC, and he is responsible for managing NCC's carbon finance program and the conservation offset project on the Dartmouth conservation lands, which he will be describing in some more detail in his presentation. Rob is also a member of the Ontario Forest Carbon Policy Technical Working Group and also sits on the verification committee of the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. His interest is in creative conservation and climate finance in order to mobilize capital to further conservation efforts across Canada and globally. Rob, we're going to turn it over to you.
Good. Thank you very much, Laura. And good morning and good afternoon, and thank you all for joining this webinar today. I'm delighted to be here this morning on behalf of the Nature Conservancy of Canada to discuss the role of carbon offsets in particular and how these types of offset projects that Andrea alluded to can offer organizations opportunities to both increase conservation and also address issues such as climate change. And also they can importantly provide a source of potential revenue to help assist us in our collective conservation efforts. So today I'd like to cover a number of topics, beginning with sort of the current state of play, both globally and in North America in terms of carbon pricing regimes, and then look at carbon itself as an ecological good and service. Then look at carbon markets, and that's both from a regulatory perspective and a voluntary market perspective, and then review some of the key carbon offset characteristics that are common to most carbon projects, and then focus a bit on the co-benefits of those projects, which is an enormously important side of it. And then turn to a live example that we as the Nature Conservancy of Canada have, which is Darkwoods, a project that we sponsor as a major conservation and forest carbon project, and leave you with some lessons learned from that project on behalf of NCC. This first slide basically shows that slide, so the current global carbon pricing mechanisms that are happening around the world. And as Andrea alluded to as well, there's a lot of activity taking place right around the world at both the national and the subnational levels of government. There's approximately 40 national governments that are actually implementing carbon pricing, and 23 subnational governments are also implementing forms of carbon pricing as well. And you see that lower right-hand side, that's with China itself is implementing over the next year a market-based carbon pricing mechanism, and that alone will probably bring the coverage of emissions around the world from 13% to somewhere between 20 and 25% emissions being covered. So there's significant activity happening around the world. Turning to North America in particular as well, this is sort of the current state of play, and you'll see there's a variety of carbon pricing mechanisms being put into place right from Mexico, which is the carbon tax, through the US and through Canada as well. And while the coverage is far from complete at this stage, it is moving forward at particularly the subnational level as well. So there is a variety of carbon pricing mechanisms ranging from carbon taxes to cap and trade schemes to fee and dividends, and a whole variety arising from those jurisdictions. Okay. I wanted to focus for a second on Canada, though, because the Canadian federal government is requiring that each of Canada's 10 provinces and territories establish a minimum price on carbon. So there is a national scheme being put into place. But federally in Canada, they're not going to dictate the means by which this carbon price is achieved. They're going to leave that up to the individual provinces to choose whichever system they want to put into place. whether it's a tax or a trading system or whatever, or a hybrid regime. But they are going to establish a minimum price on carbon and force each of the jurisdictions at the subnational level to put schemes in place to make sure that that price is set and is met. It's kind of a recognition that, you know, one size doesn't fit all within a country, and allow them some flexibility, but set a minimum price. Carbon offsets will play a key role in these schemes in terms of helping eliminate emission reductions. So it's a very encouraging sort of national program that's being put into place in Canada. Sorry. Now, the point of this slide, I think, is to emphasize that carbon, though, is just one of a very broad array of ecological goods and services that nature provides. And while it may be, you know, among the most easily measured and well recognized for its, you know, adverse effects on climate, it's important to remember that it's just one of the many services that nature does, in fact, provide. And this is actually a picture of the Tatleyoko area of British Columbia, which is a very important interior landscape that's critical in terms of the multiplicity of ecological goods and services that that kind of landscape can provide. So there's quite an array of EGNS, of which carbon sequestration and storage is just one. So it's important to keep that in mind. In terms of what a carbon offset is, it's important to sort of to define it, and this is sort of the World Resources Institute definition, which is that it's a unit of carbon dioxide equivalent that's reduced, avoided, or sequestered to compensate for emissions occurring elsewhere. And when we're talking about a ton of CO2, you generally can't see what a ton of CO2 looks like, so I always find it helpful to try to visually show what a ton of CO2 might look like. So this is a visual of what 1 ton of CO2 would look like if it were inflated as a sphere. And that sphere is basically 10 meters by 10 meters, or about 33 feet by 33 feet. So it's pretty significant, and when you consider that the world's currently emitting about 36 million tons of this per annum, you can get some sense of scale of the problem. I'd like now to turn to the various markets for carbon offsets, and they generally fall into two broad markets, either the voluntary market or the compliance-based markets. So looking at the voluntary markets first, it's important to realize that companies and organizations, they generally look to first put into place internal policies or programs designed to reduce their carbon footprints and try to reduce emissions internally before looking to offset emissions. But when they do look beyond internal programs, they often turn to the voluntary carbon market. And this voluntary carbon market, which is really a global market, is dominated by corporate buyers that are driven principally by corporate social responsibility, or CSR type of objectives. In some other cases, there are organizations that are looking to offer more green types of products. That could be things like green electricity contracts, or airlines offering to include carbon offsets in the cost of airline flights. In some other cases, less frequently, buyers in the voluntary market may buy offsets in the anticipation of legislation that might be forthcoming. So they're hoping to buy offsets a little more cheaply early on. And those are called pre-compliance kinds of buyers. Certainly the CSR buyers themselves focus, though, very much increasingly so on the co-benefits, or the beyond carbon benefits of offset projects. And we're going to discuss these co-benefits in more detail a little later on. Voluntary market buyers nearly always purchase offsets that are certified under high, well-recognized standards, international standards. And it's encouraging. More than 1,200 companies have reported to the Carbon Disclosure Project of their intention to either put into place carbon prices internally, or they already actually have carbon prices internally. So typical CSR buyers who are active in the voluntary market include companies like Disney, Microsoft, Google, United Parcel Service, Unilever, many of the banks, many other financial institutions, and many other types of companies and organizations around the world actively participate. And these buyers all want very credible, certified types of projects. So that's a quick overview of what the voluntary market would look like. Turning to the regulatory market, and that is markets that have legal obligations to reduce emissions, carbon offsets play an important role in those kind of markets as a form of flexibility mechanism that facilitate organizations achieving emission targets along with other forms of compliance mechanisms. The primary role of carbon offsets in these regulated markets is to ensure that emissions are reduced elsewhere through credible and approved offset project types. And by making them available to covered emitters or organizations that are required to reduce emissions, their costs of compliance can be reduced through the use of offsets. These offsets are typically created in sectors that aren't actually covered under the regulatory regime. But they can be used as a legal means of offsetting a regulated entity's compliance obligations. It's important, though, that most jurisdictions typically cap the use of carbon offsets as a percentage of a company's compliance obligations. So, for example, the Western Climate Initiative, which California and Quebec and soon Ontario belong, they would cap emissions at 8% of compliance obligations. So you can't use more than 8% offsets to meet your obligations. So that forces companies to actually take positive actions as well. It's important, though, that offset projects encourage, I think, the development of greater emission reductions than might otherwise occur. So it can be a very positive thing. And also, carbon offsets can be used as tools of social policy. So they can create benefits that go well beyond carbon. So both governments and organizations can achieve a multiplicity of benefits by looking at, bona fide offset projects. So I really look at them as social policy tools. This next slide shows the top 10 project types that actually occurred in 2015. 2016 numbers aren't out yet, but it probably won't be terribly dissimilar. But it gives a sense of the types of projects that were the most sought after in that year, ranging from wind, RED+, landfill methane, right down to energy efficiency types of projects. The total size of the voluntary market was about $278 million, and it covered about 84 million tons of CO2 equivalent. This is a graphical depiction of that voluntary market and gives a little more sense of the kind of project categories that are available. So the voluntary market was led by renewables in the light blue piece, then followed by forestry and other land use types, followed by methane reduction kinds of projects. So those are percentages of the total project types that occurred in the voluntary market. And the point of this slide is really to show that there's a very wide variety of potential offset project categories that can offer significant choice to voluntary market buyers. Okay. This next slide is just to underscore the importance of third-party validation, verification, and registry listing of offset projects. And I can't underscore enough the importance of developing and maintaining projects under leading international standards. Not only do these standards provide audit credibility and minimize reputational risk to organizations, but they also typically, and very importantly, provide access to insurance pools of credits which backstop credits sold. So when you're undertaking a carbon project under the verified carbon standard, for example, you contribute a portion of your offsets to a global buffer pool. And that global buffer pool will actually backstop any credits you sell. So in the event that there were some sort of reversal of credits, you could actually draw from that pool to restore them. It's also important because third-party validation verification provides important transparency. And so there's project documentation is listed on public registries. Credits are issued and actually given serial numbers, and they can be easily tracked, readily available. So transparency is very critical on these kinds of projects. So I really want to underscore that. The other dimension of offset projects is the importance of co-benefits, or the beyond carbon benefits. And carbon offsets often contain significant co-benefits that come along, particularly conservation-based projects. And they can be measured by third-party standards, such as, for example, the Climate, Community, and Biodiversity Alliance, or CCBA standard, which is actually managed by the Verified Carbon Standard right now. And that kind of standard looks at issues such as net positive climate impacts. So how do projects reduce GHG emissions and provide climate change mitigation and adaptation opportunities? It also looks at community impacts, the net positive impacts on community. It also considers things like biodiversity impacts. So how does it generate, positive biodiversity outcomes on a global, regional, or nationally significant basis? So that kind of CCBA standard layered on to a third-party carbon standard gives significant credibility to a project. And some of the specific co-benefits that are cited and used is things like they provide, projects, they create legal certainty of land ownership. That's really important because offsets need to be transferred between parties, so you have to make sure you have legal ownership. Projects that are certified under these kind of co-benefit standards also can provide significant opportunities for more marginal groups of individuals, significant job and training opportunities as well, because there's a lot of monitoring work associated with carbon projects and the ongoing verification work. They also are significant for many local communities that share in the benefits of carbon projects, say on a community-based forestry kind of project or something like that. It can be a significant source of revenue to a local community. And certainly for conservation-based projects, they have significant co-benefits that relate to biodiversity conservation, preserving habitat, high conservation value lands, watershed protection, so very significant co-benefit comes from conservation-based carbon projects, and also climate change response, both in terms of mitigation, adaptation, and also in creating landscape resiliency. So that really relates to the conservation and storage of carbon sinks, how you manage fire regimes, connectivity corridors. All these things are sort of co-benefits that can come with a conservation project that makes it far more attractive and more credible and more easily able to be sold to buyers. I want to just mention the key criteria that are very common to most carbon offset projects, and these are 7 sort of key dimensions. One is ownership. You have to demonstrate that you do legally own the land or have title of the land and therefore a legal title of the offset so that they can be transferred. They also need to be very real, that there have to be emission sources that do exist and activities have to be demonstrated to reduce and remove emissions. And so these activities have to also be very quantifiable. You have to be able to measure the emission reductions that can occur, and that can be through a calculation of carbon storage, for example, in landscapes. Very importantly is additionality, and I'll come back to that, but the benefits of a carbon offset project have to be beyond a baseline business as usual case. You have to be doing more than there was before. They also need to be permanent. These emission reductions need to be irreversible. And in the case of sequestration credits, removals have to remain sequestered for typically up to 100 years. Okay. They also need to be verifiable. You have to be able to prove that they've actually occurred and they can be accurately measured and independently verified. And finally, leakage is a concept that looks at the possibility of activity shifting elsewhere. So you want to minimize any possibility of leakage, that you're just shifting activity from one site to another because you're not achieving anything if that's what happens. So those are typical key criteria that most offset programs, both in the voluntary and regulatory market, look at in terms of offset criteria. Turning to specifically to more forest carbon project types, in conservation projects typically fall into 3 types. There are afforestation and reforestation programs, and that looks at planting trees and lands that is degraded or non-forested in order to sequester carbon over time that wouldn't otherwise have been sequestered. Improved forest management, a second regime, and that's where you're altering baseline practices such as modified harvesting regimes or reducing harvesting to increase carbon stocks. And finally, the other third one is avoided conversion or avoided deforestation types of programs, which is really where you're avoiding the conversion of forested land to higher value market alternatives for real estate development, golf courses, things like that. So typically forest carbon projects fall into one of these 3 types of categories. Okay. And with that fairly broad overview of carbon offsets, I'd like to specifically talk about a project and show how you can actually land on a carbon offset project that's aligned with conservation. And specifically, we'd like to cite as an example Darkwoods. Darkwoods was purchased by the Nature Conservancy of Canada in 2008. It's a fee simple acquisition. It's located in southeastern British Columbia, and it covers an area of about 136,000 acres or 55,000 hectares. It actually is the largest private conservation initiative in Canadian history. So that's sort of non-public land that we own outright. It's a critically important conservation project. It provides habitat for endangered mountain caribou, for species of special concern like grizzly bears, and many, many other important species and habitats are protected by this enormously large landscape. It's also important in that it provides an important and ongoing flow of ecological goods and services to many, many communities. So it really has national and global importance as a conservation project. It also is a forestry carbon project as well, and we'll come through that. This is a slide just to give some sense of the location of Dartwoods. Beyond Carbon's 136,000 acres in site, or its 55,000 hectares, it also connects with another enormously large landscape of protected areas as well. So overall, it creates more than 250,000 acres of protected landscape in southeastern British Columbia, over 100,000 acres of protected lands. This project is located just actually north of the state borders of Idaho and Washington in the southeastern portion of BC. So it's an important landscape both in Canada and also for the U.S. as well. Dartmouth is, though, first and foremost a conservation project, and we have a significant conservation vision for Dartwoods that it's managed to provide, productive, resilient ecosystems that support native species throughout time, all while maintaining a world-class forest carbon project on it as well, with strong community support. And we look at this kind of conservation project and look at it from a zoning perspective. So we have a significant and important management zoning regime in place that has a primary conservation zone where there's strict protection of biodiversity targets, limited infrastructure, no timber harvesting, things of that nature. And then a secondary conservation zone where we do allow multiple uses, including a small-scale timber operation, which I'll talk about, and active management of biodiversity targets and community access. So in a landscape like this, which is this large, we do allow some recreational use, but that access is controlled, and we actually engage community partners to help us manage this landscape. So it really is a kind of a win-win for nature and the communities as well. The conservation priorities in Dartwoods, these are the conservation targets, and these are governed under a very comprehensive science-based property management plan that's been developed specifically for this site. So first and foremost, it is a conservation project with clearly established targets as listed there that we wish to protect. But Dartwoods also stores an enormous amount of carbon within its landscapes and within its old-growth forest, and it continues to sequester carbon. So consequently, the Forest Carbon Project creates an additional incentive to protect the carbon in perpetuity, while also providing us with a source of financing for the ongoing stewardship of this enormous landscape. So it's a great source of funding for us as well. Dartwoods is a carbon project that falls under the improved forest management regime. You recall I mentioned those three regimes. It's an IFM kind of project. We originally undertook it as a pilot project back in 2011, principally to raise funds for the long-term stewardship of this property. It was a significant project to undertake. It took 3 expert firms to assist us in developing this carbon project. It took about 3 years. It's the first Canadian forest carbon project validated and verified under the Verified Carbon Standard, which is the leading international voluntary standard. In addition, we have also certified Dartwoods under the CCBA standard that I talked about before for its enormous co-benefits. And it's actually been awarded a gold level rating for exceptional biodiversity benefits. So it's an enormously attractive project from a conservation perspective and also from an offset perspective, because the offsets are quite charismatic in nature. The IFM regime, it basically, the carbon offsets arise by altering common baseline practices that would have occurred on this landscape had NCC not bought it. So we look to increase carbon stocks in standing forests, principally in this case by reducing logging volumes and modifying harvesting practices. The offsets that are generated are called ex post, and ex post just means the carbon is already stored there. It's not stored over time. It's already there. There is some ongoing sequestration as well, but these ex post credits are the ones that are certified under VCS. To give some sense of scale, a project of this size, which is an enormous project, is expected to generate about 12 million carbon offsets over its 100-year project life. And those will be sold principally to CSR buyers if we're successful in doing so, although that is always challenging, I can tell you. But we're also hoping to have Dartwoods offsets become regulatory compliant within Canada, so they be recognized as legitimate offsets to be used by compliance buyers. And that's an ongoing process as these regimes are put into place in terms of what is permissible and what's not permissible. I just want to focus on some of the key tests that we had to meet to make this a bona fide offset project, and additionality is first and foremost the most critical offset test. And that really refers to emission reductions achieved by a project beyond which would have occurred if we hadn't bought it. So it's kind of the business as usual case. And in the case of Darkwoods, we avoid emissions that would have resulted from an alternative buyer of that landscape, basically deforesting that landscape. And there was certainly ample evidence that that was going to occur had the Nature Conservancy not successfully been able to buy Darkwoods. The other key aspect of a carbon offset project is establishing a baseline. And that's kind of the level of emissions against which all emission reductions are measured. So in the case of Darkwoods, as I said, it would have likely been bought by an alternative timber harvesting company that would have depleted those timber resources over, we estimate, about 15 years. So by avoiding that, we're able to continue to sequester carbon that would otherwise have been lost, and that gives rise to offsets. Permanence is another key issue in carbon projects, and that refers to the length of time that carbon remains stored, and also assesses the risk of it being released. So it's challenging in sequestration projects to demonstrate permanence. So it's a very rigorously assessed dimension of a carbon project, and they look at the risk of non-permanence over its project life. In the case of Darkwoods, it was rated quite low, the risk of non-permanence. So it's, and that looks at many issues such as, pest infestation, the risk of disease, devastating fire, extreme weather events, geological risk, illegal logging, all sort of threats to a landscape that could otherwise result in a reversal of carbon coming about. So that's a very rigorously assessed kind of metric, and one that's actually buffered against. We set up buffer pools to guard against those things. And the final concept is leakage that I talked about before, which is really the unanticipated loss of carbon reductions outside a project's boundary. So are we just shifting activity elsewhere? Again, risk of leakage was considered very low in the case of Darkwoods. It's a fairly modest harvest level that we're actually conducting on that, and we also buffer that as well. So those are some of the very key tests in carbon projects to keep in mind. As I said, though, we do conduct a very small forest harvesting operation on this as well. So a portion of the secondary conservation zone on Darkwoods is a working forest, and Darkwoods is a working forest. And we maintain that project both to, I think, keep the local community employment levels at a reasonable level, because there is a small mill that relies on Darkwoods forests. It also helps us achieve certain conservation objectives as well. There's been a mountain pine beetle kill in BC, and while that's not been a big factor in the case of Darkwoods, we have removed some deadwood, which helps increase carbon storage elsewhere in regeneration of forests. But we have reduced the forest harvesting on this project to about 10,000 cubic meters per year. It's what we call a conservation-based, very small harvest level. And that's relative to what would have happened about 250,000 to 300,000 cubic meters per year had it been bought by someone else. So we look at forest harvesting opportunistically. It's guided by our conservation objectives, market conditions, and the requirements of a forest carbon project. This next slide, it looks a little busy, but it's really not. It's essentially designed to show how carbon credits arise. So that top green line is what's considered to be the business as usual case. And that is what would have happened had the Nature Conservancy not bought this. There would have been harvesting taking place at a level of about 250 to 300,000 cubic meters per year over the first 15 to 20 years of this project life. That is then compared to the project baseline, which is the NCC harvest level that we actually do conduct at 10,000 cubic meters per year, this conservation-based harvest. So the difference between those two, the business as usual case, which is what someone else would have done to it, and what we are doing with it, that's what gives rise to the carbon credits, the difference between those two. So it's really important that conservation-based forest carbon project offers significant potential for upfront carbon credits with very verifiable conservation-based co-benefits to come from it as well. So that's how the carbon offsets actually arise. So Darkwoods, we look at this as a conservation project first. It has forest carbon offsets and enormous co-benefits that come along with the project, from endangered species such as mountain caribou through flora and fauna and important connectivity corridors. I want to also now sort of end with just some lessons learned on a forest carbon project that's being run by a conservation organization. And it's critically important just to educate both internally and externally stakeholders on how a carbon project can actually work and what the requirements are. So that ranges everything from getting a board of directors on side with why it's important, with getting internal staff to understand how the carbon project works, and getting also your external stakeholders like donors comfortable that it's consistent with your mission. It's also important to use an existing methodology or an existing standard wherever possible. It's expensive to have to create it from scratch. We had to do that ourselves. So looking at a verified carbon standard or a gold standard and using the methodologies that already exist is critically important, I think, in terms of trying to minimize the costs. The concepts like additionality, permanence, and leakage, they're challenging to understand. They're challenging to demonstrate and to communicate to people. So I wouldn't underestimate the importance of that. Financing, there can be significant upfront and ongoing cost to develop and manage a project. So the economics of a project has to be carefully considered by a conservation organization. You have to look at what it's going to actually cost, not only just to validate it, but to verify it and monitor it on an ongoing basis. And that's relative to really the revenues that you expect to generate from the project. I also can't, again, underscore enough the critical need for third-party validation and verification. And I might just mention that in the case of Dartwoods, we actually underwent a third-party audit by the British Columbia Auditor General on the project, which raised questions as to additionality and other metrics. And the fact that we had this project validated and verified under the world's leading international standard by the probably leading carbon audit firms was enormously important in terms of credibility. So Dartwoods came through with great colors as a result of that. So that third-party validation verification is really important to keep in mind. Also, just the need for scale is important as well. The larger the project, typically the better the economics are. There's also possibilities of being able to aggregate smaller projects together. It's important that you consider staffing levels, the infrastructure requirements of carbon projects. There are ongoing requirements to maintain the validation, so you have to make sure that your staff is trained on those things. The other thing is, I guess, also considering what markets are available. So you also want to think about what markets do you want to sell into, what's the voluntary market look like, who's going to sell the offsets for your organization, what kind of pricing do you need to make it make economic sense for your organization. So all kinds of considerations as you consider implementing a carbon project. And finally, though, I do want to leave you with the thought that a conservation-based carbon offset project can be a win-win for organizations and for nature. They can be very complementary when done with the combination of science and a strategic approach to conservation. So with that, I will turn it back over to Laura, and we'll be happy, both Andrea and I, to take any questions. So thank you very much for your attention.
Great, Rob. This is Laura. Thank you for an excellent presentation of a lot of very complicated material, and I think Andrea's excellent overview and for a big picture look at Paris and how it connects to land conservation projects, followed by your more detailed assessment of how those projects actually can work on the ground, was enormously helpful. We do have some questions, and we're going to take we have some extra time here to be able to go through them. So I think I'm going to ask both of you, and maybe Andrea first, since Rob just finished talking, is whether you see carbon markets in North America as effective and efficient. And what do you think are the major mistakes made in setting up these schemes? And of course, Andrea, I know you have great familiarity with California in particular.
Thanks. That's a very good question and very timely. Yeah, markets are very important, but they're not the only tool in reducing emissions. In our California experience, we have very ambitious goals for carbon reductions by 2020 and 2030 and 2050, but we don't rely on markets alone. It's only one tool that we use, along with very aggressive regulations for emission reductions from utilities and ports and energy efficiency, the transportation fleet, and so on. And we also have various types of incentives, such as subsidies for purchasing electric vehicles and so on. So the point is that the cap and trade market is a very important tool, but it's not the only tool. It is a mechanism to put a price on carbon so that the external impacts of carbon emissions are internalized in the price of the product. And so the whole economy is pushed towards more low carbon solutions. But also remember that these markets are all very new. We have one of the older ones along with the EU ETS, and we've all gone through the lumps and bumps of learning about how to allocate allowances and price setting and caps and all of that. So don't come to too quick a judgment that they do or don't work. I am a firm believer that they are important. They are a way to put a price on carbon. We opted for a very slow on-ramp so as not to shock the economy. So if you just look at cap and trade over the last 3 years, maybe you can argue whether it was useful or not. But what we do have is a really great learning curve by both the emitting sector and the offset sector, and commitment is building. And so I'm a firm believer to stick with it. So Rob, do you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, no, I'd echo, I think, what you said, Andrea. I think they're excellent comments. I mean, I think market-based mechanisms, we are learning a lot over time as these become more, more normalized. So without choosing which kind of market we want to rely on, whether it's a carbon tax kind of regime or a cap and trade or a fee and dividend, there's a variety of mechanisms that can be very important incentives to pricing carbon. And regulation is an important dimension of this as well. So setting caps and targets is important. So I think the markets are getting more efficient as we learn more about them, frankly.
Great, thank you both. Rob, we actually have some very specific questions for you about Darkwood. Sure. I think people are curious about the actual, the financing. So one question is, how much money does 12 million carbon credits really represent? And what is the market price right now for a carbon credit?
Sure,
and there's some interest in understanding what the estimated revenue over the life of the project is going to be from the carbon offset part.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's not one that's as transparent or as we would like it to be. Essentially, 12 million credits is really over a 100-year life. So the bulk of the credits in the case of a Darkwoods tend to come up in the first 15 to 20 years of that project, because as I said, Darkwoods is a case where you're avoiding deforestation over a 15 to 20-year project life. There is ongoing, carbon credits that arise later on, but by far the bulk of them tend to come in the first 15 to 20 years. So that's one thing. So there's a fair bit of upfront potential revenue. The challenge in voluntary markets, though, is trying to monetize that. And there are significant, monetizing, 300,000 carbon credits per year is a significant undertaking, and that's challenging to do. In terms of current pricing levels, prices probably range right now in the voluntary market anywhere from, I'd say, for a project like this, $5 to $15, something like that. It's difficult, though, to get very large size transactions. So buyers tend to buy portfolios of offsets. They won't put all their eggs in one basket, so to speak. So to come up with an estimated revenue, it's always challenging. It can be hundreds of thousands a year. It could be, upwards of $1 million, but it's very much dependent on the dynamics of the market. So I'm not trying to avoid it. It's just there's not any bright line answer for that one question.
Great. Thank you, Rob. Andrea, I want to go back to a question for you, and a sort of a bigger general question. The question is posed that in the EU, climate tracking in public spending is very popular, and it's usually done at a very high level of aggregation and mostly used as a general policy issue. So do you think this approach will pay back, or should we concentrate on the quality of this spending more than the simple quantity?
Good question. Let me take a stab at it this way. The EU and the European countries and the development banks have all been extremely important as Kickstarter donors to help countries start to address the climate issue? How do they even, developing countries have a lot on their plate, so how do they even start with thinking about converting to a low carbon economy? And the EU has funded capacity building and governance in countries all over the world. And now many countries actually have a first draft of an NDC, and now they need to start implementing it. So the point here is how to bring this aggregate spending at these large international finance organizations down to the ground, because that is where carbon gains actually are delivered. If you're talking about the land sector, then you want to have projects such as conservation projects and Rob's project and countless projects, you know, that we see from conservation organizations all over. You want to see this tool being used, taken advantage of, to help deliver carbon gains on the ground. So I think these MDCs are the opportunity for conservation organizations to get in on the ground floor of your country's program, as they have to start learning how to do this. And so let them know you're interested. Conservation projects are a way of delivering real carbon gains. I think that's my main point. So yes, the aggregate funding has been extremely important, and now this is an opportunity through the NDCs to start actually putting money on the ground.
Thank you, Andrea. I think we have time for a couple more, and Rob, I want to go back to a detailed question, which is how can a project or an organization avoid costs of verification that are simply too high for the project to bear? Or, figured another way, what would be the minimum size of a project to make verification a realistic option?
Yeah, that's a great question too. We get asked that a lot. One of the advantages I think that we're seeing more and more of is aggregating projects. So certainly as the regulatory market starts to develop more, there is more contemplation of being able to put projects together. So you can knit some projects together that have common characteristics for a carbon project. That's particularly the case in the agricultural sector. It's a little more challenging in a forestry kind of sector because the regimes, you know, the types of harvesting regimes are different. So scale does matter, but it will also depend on the price of carbon. So if you're going to be actually selling offsets from your project into a regulated marketplace, like for example in California, which does recognize, you know, forestry projects throughout the United States, you've got a regulated price, and it's a lot easier to kind of look at the economics of size and scale. It's more challenging in the voluntary market. So, but I mean, typically, I mean, you know, there's no, again, no bright line test on this thing, but you wouldn't do, you know, you probably wouldn't do a carbon project on 100 acres. You would consider that probably north of 1,000 acres. And again, it depends on what standard you're going to use and the costs of it. But typically, a little larger scale is better, but consider also knitting some together. That would be an option.
Yeah, the aggregation seems to be a theme that's coming up, and I wonder if you know of a way to make that easier for projects or organizations to connect with each other. Is there, you know, is there the development somewhere of a clearinghouse or a connecting service or anything like that?
Yeah,
how would we just go about doing it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there is, not to my knowledge, there's no sort of clearinghouse. I think what, you know, I can look at, say, Ontario as an example that's putting a whole carbon pricing mechanism into place, and there is, the regulation will provide a lot more guidance on that, but it's very much, I think, it's more association-based probably in terms of trying to connect. You know, we'd be delighted to, I mean, certainly people can contact me if they want any questions, and I can probably direct them to some sources as well. But, you know, we're not at the stage where, unfortunately, there's yet a central clearinghouse for this kind of introductory service, so to speak.
Great. Now, a question that I know both of you have expertise in forests, but we've got a question that is related to non-forest projects, and specifically that permanent grasslands are quite close to forests and carbon stored underground, and then carbon emitted if a grassland is plowed. And so there's, potential for sequestration there. So what examples or experience do you have of using carbon credits to fund grassland conservation, and especially a way to give compensation directly to farmers to prevent their plowing, intensification, or fertilizer use or other practices that are detrimental to the carbon sequestration of grasslands? And where would you point people for good examples of grasslands? And Andrea, maybe I'll turn this over to you first, and then Rob can answer too.
Well, I'll give a very general overview of this. It's correct. Most of the attention on offsets and carbon credits has been on forests because the carbon stocks are so high and the threats of tropical deforestation so enormous and the emissions so high. But as we learn more and more, we do know that grasslands and agricultural practices are very important to the carbon storage side of the coin too, and there is more attention being paid to it. The primary issue with giving carbon credits for ag practices is the permanence issue. That yes, you can delay plowing for a while, but eventually the saved carbon may be released, and so the permanence issue puts a different spin on how you would give a carbon credit. That said, it doesn't mean it's impossible. It's just harder to approach. But what I suggest is that you look at that slide later that where I have a quantitative approach and then the qualitative approach. And for those of you involved in grasslands and agricultural practices, look at ways that you could address your country's MDC in terms of adaptation and some sequestration on this qualitative model. That what you want to show in your country's accounting is that you are keeping that land in a low emitting use. You are, through your conservation project, you're keeping it as a grassland, or you're keeping it in good quality agricultural production, and that is your contribution to your country's NDC. Whether you can actually monetize that, that's a question really of internal, your country dynamics and where the conversation goes internationally. It is harder to do a financial support for good carbon practices, but those are flat-out grant programs, and if your country can establish those for your local farming communities, then that is something that you should advocate for.
Rob, do you have anything to add to that?
I'd echo what Andrea said, and also just underscore the importance of grasslands, which is really the most threatened biome in the world according to the IUCN. So it's a significant program for us at the Nature Conservancy of Canada, looking at sustainable grasslands right now. Certainly, there are the Verified Carbon Standard has a grasslands protocol. Ontario, as it's developing its standards here, is actually also putting a grasslands protocol into place as well. I'm not aware of significant grasslands carbon projects that are actually taking place. There are probably some pilots underway, but not significant size ones. But it is very much one that's emerging and will be I suspect, a dominant theme for carbon offsets in future. So it's one to stay aware of. In terms of the question about paying landowners and ranchers for for maintaining good practices, that's really important as well. We've done some pilot projects on that as well, not with carbon revenues, but more from payments for services to try to maintain ranch lands in an optimal grazing pattern or managing for biodiversity. So, but certainly I do believe that grasslands is an emerging area of carbon finance that is going to come to the fore very quickly. So I just don't think there's a lot actually on the ground right now being done, but there's a lot being worked on.
Great, thank you both. We're going to have to wrap up soon. Just a couple last things. One is we did get from one of our participants a note that at least in Colombia, the base cost of carbon certification seems to require projects that are at least 1,000 hectares, which is 2,500 acres of forest. and that, the suggestion, which I think is consistent with what you've already suggested, that maybe there really needs to be a sort of lead organization that is putting together, that is actually aggregating those projects in a more proactive way to lower those verification costs. And I think maybe we'll wrap up with a question. And one thing I should say is, particularly for people who have very specific questions about the Darkwood project, I know that Rob is happy to have questions directly to him on the specific aspects of the Darkwood project, and we will show his email in just a minute on the screen. But Andrea, if we could just wrap up with a general question of what you see as the next step for countries that have already submitted their NDCs and what's going to be happening next. And if you're willing, you might even speculate if there is, we don't know, frankly, what the U.S. is going to do next with regard to the Paris Agreement. But if we were to hypothesize that there might be a lack of follow-through, what effect will that have on markets?
Well, you're right. We don't know what the federal government is going to be doing in terms of climate policy, but let me assure you that there is a lot of energy still on the ground in the subnational areas. Certainly the West Coast, the Northeast have markets and regulations, and we are totally committed to continuing on. California likes to plow new ground and set an example, and our governor and our legislature are totally committed to that. So there's a bit of hope. As to countries that are now implementing their NDCs, this is up to each one of the countries and the advocates within the country to make sure that these don't become just paper documents that are on a shelf and don't get attention. The problem of climate change is just becoming more and more evident, daily with extreme weather events and so on. And I think it's up to everyone who believes in this issue, who's concerned about it, to be an advocate in their country and use the NDC as a tool. It's not the only tool, but here we have a new one, and it's a way for you to actually try and influence the attention that's paid.
Bob, any comment on that also, or anything you would add to that good response from Andrea?
No, I think actually Andrea's covered that very well. Probably, I think she's our resident expert on NDCs. So yeah.
Yes, she is.
Yeah.
So I said we were going to wrap up, but I feel like we covered forests and grasslands, and we have gotten just two inquiries about the status of wetlands and whether or not there's any good examples of monetizing those resources, and sort of the status of carbon storage in wetlands. Could one of you briefly answer that, and then we will wrap up?
Sure. I mean, certainly wetlands, again, enormous sources of carbon stores, particularly peatlands, things like that as well. So that's well recognized, and that's something that has to be figured into countries' targets as well. There is some wetland restoration. Our experience, frankly, on the offset side is more on biodiversity offset for wetland restoration projects than sort of on just the carbon dimensions of them. So I think we are seeing, wetland restoration as a kind of project that offers multiple ecological goods and services benefits that are beyond carbon. So we've not actually monetized carbon from that, but have looked at them in terms of biodiversity offsets, which is another whole topic entirely.
Yeah. Andrea, any projects you know of in the wetlands realm that we should mention before we wrap up?
Well, I concur with what Rob has said. There's been a lot of attempts to write protocols for wetland retention or wetland protection. Again, the issue is the permanence of the carbon. If you're going to use it for an offset, remember what an offset is. An offset is a ton of CO2 that is emitted by somebody who's burning fossil fuels, and they're offsetting that. That ton is going to be in the atmosphere for thousands of years. So if you're going to call something an offset, you have to sequester an equal amount of carbon in a biological or other kind of system. And so that's why ag lands and wetlands are difficult to monetize. And I think really it's really a policy response rather than a market response, and rewards for good practices in restoring mangroves, restoring coastal estuaries, protecting them from pollution, and so on. The reason we don't have protocols for wetlands and ag lands is because they really are harder to make the case that they're a true offset. But offsets and markets are not the only response. Remember, there's incentives and regulations and grant programs. So it may be that that's a more productive way to go.
Great. Well, I think that's a terrific way to wrap up. So I want to thank you all for being on this webinar, and I really want to thank Andrea and Rob again for those excellent presentation and great responses to questions. As you see on the slide, contact information for both of them is available there, and I'm sure they would be interested in your questions or anything we weren't able to fit into our Q&A session just then. And also please visit our website, landconservationnetwork.org, and as we said, we will be putting the entire recorded webinar online. And once you unhook from us, you're going to get a survey asking what webinar topics would be of interest to you in the future. We really value your feedback, and we're putting together a webinar schedule for the rest of the year. And if there's anything else you'd like us to know, please feel free to email us. We'd love to hear from you. And again, thank you so much to Rob and to Andrea and to all of you. So long.